The Galactic Council had been meeting for 6 hours when the anomaly showed up on the long-range sensors. Nobody noticed at first. The Vethkai delegate was in the middle of a speech about resource rights in the Outer Rim. The Sulhari were arguing, as they always did, about border coordinates. The Drenni sat in their corner of the chamber and said nothing, which was their way of saying everything. The anomaly blinked once on the sensor board, then twice. Then it stopped blinking and became a solid, unmoving dot. Counselor Mara Voss of the Drenni Collective was the first to see it. She had a habit of watching screens that other people ignored. It had kept her alive through 3 wars and 2 attempted coups. She leaned forward in her seat, very slowly, and looked at the coordinate stamp beneath the dot. Sector 7, edge of charted space. She knew what was in Sector 7. Nothing. Sector 7 was supposed to have nothing in it. The Council had agreed on this 12 years ago, after the Vethkai pulled their mining rigs from the asteroid belt there. Dead sector. Surveyed. Catalogued. Empty. She pressed a single button on her console. The main display activated. The Vethkai delegate stopped talking mid-sentence. Everyone looked up. The dot on the screen was not small. The scale indicator in the bottom corner of the display told the story. Whatever had appeared in Sector 7 was 11 kilometers long, 4 kilometers wide at its widest point, and generating a mass reading that made the sensor calibration system run a self-check, because it assumed something was broken. Nothing was broken. The thing was just that big. "What is that?" said the Sulhari ambassador, whose name was Preth, and who was not usually a person who asked questions without already knowing the answers. Nobody replied. The sensor suite updated. The object was not moving. It had appeared at sublight speed from a fold point that the Council's charts showed as inactive. Fold points didn't just activate. You needed a ship capable of generating a fold wake powerful enough to punch through dead space, and the engineering required for that was the kind that took centuries to develop. The Vethkai had it. The Sulhari had it. The Drenni had a version of it. Nobody else in the known galaxy had it. Mara Voss looked at the object on the screen. Then she looked at the species marker the sensor suite had assigned to it. The suite had scanned the drive signature. It had cross-referenced the fold-wake pattern against every known engine type in its database. It had run the check 4 times. The marker it had attached to the object read, Terran. Mara Voss sat back in her chair. Terran. The word moved through the chamber like a cold current. She watched it cross the faces of the other delegates one by one. The Vethkai delegate, whose species had 4 eyes, blinked all of them in sequence. The Sulhari ambassador Preth went very still, even the Drenni. And the Drenni made it a point of cultural pride to react to nothing, shifted in their seats. Terran. Earth. Humans. The species that had been granted observer status 14 years ago. The ones who had sent a single diplomat to council chambers with a translation device, and a handshake, and an offer of trade agreements. The ones whose home system sat in an unremarkable stretch of the Orion Arm, with 1 habitable planet, 2 small moons, and no strategic value whatsoever. The ones who had, for 14 years, been very quiet. "Pull up visual," said Counselor Voss. The camera array in Sector 7 was old. Nobody had maintained it because nobody expected to use it. The image it sent back was grainy, slightly time-delayed, and still managed to make the entire council chamber go silent for 30 seconds. The ship was the color of storm clouds, not the ornamental gray of the Vethkai warships, which were designed to look threatening. Not the polished silver of the Sulhari dreadnoughts, which were designed to look expensive. This thing was the gray of something that had been built to work. The surface was marked with scorch patterns and micro-impact craters, and the kind of wear that came from distance, not combat. It had traveled far to get here. There were gun ports along the side. Mara counted them before she could stop herself. She lost count at 40. The ship had more gun ports than she could count in a casual glance. "How long has Earth been building that?" said the Vethkai delegate, whose name was Sor Vatha, and who was usually very good at controlling his voice. "Unknown," said the Council's tactical officer from her station at the edge of the chamber. Her name was Fen, and she was Drenni, and she had been running numbers since the object appeared on the screen. Based on the mass reading, and the estimated construction timeline for a vessel of this configuration, she paused, not for effect, because the number she was about to say required a moment to make sense of. Minimum 18 years. 18 years. 14 years ago, Earth had walked into the council chamber with a diplomat and a handshake. 4 years before that, they had already started building this. They were building it before they joined, said Preth. The Sulhari ambassador said it the way you say a thing when you are not surprised, but you are troubled that you are not surprised. They joined the council while this was already under construction. We don't know its purpose, said Fen. It's 11 kilometers long, said Sorvaith. Fen had no response to that. The Earth diplomat's name was Jonas Webb. He had been in his quarters on the council station when his communicator activated, and now he was standing in the corridor outside the council chamber, in a shirt that was slightly wrinkled, and with the particular look of someone who had been told to come immediately, and come without explanation. 2 Drenni security officers flanked him. They were not touching him. They were not threatening him. They were simply there, and they were large, and they had the posture of people who had been told to stay close. Councillor Voss met him in the corridor. She was a full head shorter than him. This did not affect her presence in any measurable way. "Counselor," he said. "What's—" "Come inside," she said. He came inside. The chamber was quiet when they entered. Every delegate was at their station. The main screen was still showing the ship. Jonas Webb walked to the center of the room, saw the screen, and stopped walking. He looked at the ship for a long time. Then he looked at Councillor Voss. "You knew," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "How long?" "Since before I arrived." He said it without apology or hesitation. The program started 22 years ago. Construction began 18 years ago. I was assigned to council relations 4 years into construction. "Why?" said Preth. Jonas Webb turned to look at the Sulhari ambassador. He had the kind of face that was hard to read quickly. Not blank, just patient. Like someone who had decided what they were going to say a long time ago, and was in no hurry to say it wrong. "Because we needed time," he said, "and we needed to understand who we were dealing with before we showed you what we'd made." "Showed us," said Sorvaith, and there was something in the Vethkai delegate's voice that was not quite anger, and not quite fear, but occupied the specific geography between those two things. "The ship isn't armed," said Jonas Webb. The chamber went very still. Fen checked her sensors. She checked them again. She looked up. "The gun ports," she said. "They're sealed. Drive locked. The weapon systems are not." Another pause. Longer this time. "They are not active. The power routing shows 0 charge to any offensive system." "It came here with its guns cold," said Preth. "Yes," said Jonas Webb. "Why?" said Mara Voss. He looked at the screen. At the ship sitting in Sector 7, with its 11 kilometers of gray metal, and its 40-plus sealed gun ports, and its engines cooling after a fold jump, from somewhere the council's charts didn't track. "Because we wanted to ask before we did anything else," he said. "Ask what?" said Sorvaith. Jonas Webb reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small data chip. He held it out toward the communications console at the center of the chamber. "May I?" he said. Nobody stopped him. He walked to the console and inserted the chip. A file opened. Audio and text, simultaneously, in every language the translation matrix could handle. A voice came through the chamber speakers. A woman's voice, calm and measured, with an undertone of something that was not quite tiredness, and not quite certainty, but some third thing that sat between them. "This is Admiral Sarah Okafor, of the ERS Unyielding, Earth's first interstellar battleship. We are transmitting on all council frequencies. We have arrived in Sector 7, at the coordinates registered with the Council 14 years ago, as Earth's designated observation zone. We are unarmed in posture, non-hostile in intent, and requesting formal permission to approach the Council station." A pause. "We are also requesting that this message be forwarded to every fleet currently operating in Council space. We have information relevant to every species in this chamber. We did not want to transmit on open frequencies without permission." Another pause. "Then, we've been watching the Kethra migrations for 3 years. We think everyone needs to know what we've found." The message ended. The chamber was so quiet that Mara Voss could hear the environmental system cycling air through the vents above the ceiling tiles. She looked at the data chip sitting in the console. She looked at Jonas Webb. "The Kethra," she said. "Yes," he said. "The Kethra were not a species that anyone discussed in casual session. They were not a species anyone discussed at all. if they could avoid it. They existed at the edge of mapped space, beyond the last survey marker, and the 3 attempts to establish contact with them over the past century had each ended in a way that the Council's historical archive described as inconclusive, and that everyone in this chamber understood to mean something considerably more definitive than that. "What did you find?" said Sorvaith. His voice was different now. The geography between anger and fear had shifted. Something else had moved in. Jonas Webb looked at the screen, at the ship, at its sealed gun ports and its cooling engines, and its 11 kilometers of storm cloud gray. "The migration's changed," he said. 3 years ago. Direction, speed, formation density. Everything changed. We've been tracking the pattern." He turned back to the chamber. "They're not migrating anymore." He let that sit for a moment. "They're converging." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Mara Voss had heard in 20 years of council sessions. She looked around the chamber at the faces of the Vethkai and the Sulhari and her own Drenni colleagues, and she saw the same thing in all of them. The Kethra convergence. That single phrase, delivered in the flat and careful voice of a man who had been holding it for the right moment, had done what 6 hours of political argument could not. It had made everyone in the room want to be on the same side. "Forward the Admiral's message," said Mara Voss. "To who?" said the communications officer. "Everyone," she said. She looked at Jonas Webb. "And tell the Admiral," she said, "that she has permission to approach." Webb nodded once. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a second communicator. "A private one," she noted. He pressed a button. She said yes, he said into it. And somewhere out in Sector 7, 11 kilometers of storm cloud gray metal began to move. The message hit the Vethkai fleet first. Admiral Sorkatha, of the Vethkai 3rd Formation, was 3 days out from the council station, running patrol routes along the Outer Rim corridor. He had 42 ships under his command. Destroyers, mostly. 2 heavy cruisers. 1 carrier that was older than his career but still flew straight. He was eating when the message came in. He read it once. Then he told his communications officer to kill all outgoing transmissions and read it again. The officer stared at him. Killing transmissions during active patrol was a protocol violation. Sorkatha was not a man known for protocol violations. "Sir, kill them," he said. They went quiet. He read the message a 3rd time. "The Kethra are converging." He had not seen those words written down in his entire 30-year career. He had heard them spoken, once, by an old admiral at a decommissioning ceremony, in the specific way that old soldiers say things they are not supposed to say to young soldiers but say anyway, because they have decided it is important. The old admiral had been describing the second contact attempt, the one the archive called inconclusive. Sorkatha had been 23. He had never forgotten the way the old man's hands looked when he said it. Still, completely still. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of a species-level memory. He looked out the viewport at the patrol corridor, at the empty, well-charted, utterly familiar stretch of space he had been flying for 6 months. "The Kethra are converging. Get me the fleet channel," he said. I thought, "Internal fleet channel," he said. "Not outgoing. Get me my captains." The message hit the Sulhari 7th Fleet 40 minutes later. Admiral Prethayan, cousin to the ambassador, which was how things worked in Sulhari command structure, read it on the bridge of the dreadnought Absolute Threshold, and said nothing for 3 full minutes. Her bridge crew watched her. She was a woman who processed information visibly, not emotionally. The Sulhari did not value emotional processing, but architecturally. You could watch her mind build the structure of a problem from the outside, see the walls go up, see the load-bearing pieces slot into place. This time, the walls weren't going up. The structure wasn't forming. She read the message a second time and felt something she hadn't felt in 40 years of active service. She felt the structure of her understanding of the galaxy shift 2 degrees to the left. Not collapse, not break, just shift, the way a foundation shifts when something large walks past it, and you realize for the first time that the ground is not as fixed as you had assumed. "The Terran ship," she said. "What's its current position?" Her navigation officer checked. "Moving from Sector 7 toward the council station, sublight, slow." "How slow?" "Very." A pause. "It's moving like it's trying not to scare anyone." Prethayan looked at the navigation display, at the dot moving across the sector map with deliberate, careful slowness. An 11-kilometer ship moving carefully. That was the detail that cracked something open in her chest. Not the size of the ship, not the message about the Kethra, the careful, slow movement. The choice to cross that distance at a speed that said, "We see that you are watching us, and we want you to have time to get used to the idea."
"Helm," she said.
"Admiral. Set course for the council station." She looked at the message one more time. Then she closed it. "And kill our active targeting systems." The bridge went quiet. "Admiral. If the Terrans can come through a full jump with their guns cold," she said, "we can cross a patrol corridor without pointing ours at anything." She paused. "We're going to need to stop pointing things at each other for a while." Nobody argued. The absolute threshold turned and began to move. The Drenny fleet got the message last, because the Drenny communications relay was routed through 3 encryption layers and a committee review process, and by the time it cleared the committee it was 2 hours old. Fleet Commander Venash read it in her command center aboard the Silence Between Stars, which was the Drenny flagship and was named, as all Drenny flagships were named, after a concept that had no direct translation in any other language. She did not read it twice. The Drenny prided themselves on reading things once and understanding them completely. Venash had been doing it since she was old enough to read. She read the message once, folded the data sheet, and set it on her console with the particular precision of someone who was being careful with something fragile. She sat for a while. The Drenny had lost 6 ships to the Kethra in the first contact attempt. The Council archive said, inconclusive. The Drenny historical record was more specific. It named all 6 ships and all of their crew members, and the exact manner in which each ship had ceased to be a ship and become instead a field of debris. 312 names. She had read them all. Everyone in Drenny Command had read them all. It was part of the orientation for flag officers. "The Kethra are converging. Signal the council station," she said. "Yes, Commander. Tell Counselor Voss that the fleet is standing by." She picked up her stylus and turned it in her fingers. "And tell her that we want to speak with the Terran Admiral before anything else happens." "Understood." Quietly, she added. The communications officer looked at her. "Send it quietly," she said. "Don't route it through the open channel. Direct line to the counselor's personal console." She set the stylus down. "The Sulhari and the Vethkai will be moving toward the station. I don't want them to think we're coordinating without them, and I don't want them to see us ask for a private meeting and assume we are. So the message needs to look like a status report until it's in Voss's hands." The officer nodded slowly. "You think they'll cooperate," he said. "The Sulhari and the Vethkai. You think they'll actually—" "I think the Kethra convergence is the one thing in this galaxy that makes everyone stop posturing," she said. "And I think the humans know that." She looked at the message, still folded on her console. "I think they've known it for a while." The ERS Unyielding crossed the boundary into Council Station space, at 0300 station time. It did not hail. It had sent its message. It had received permission to approach. It moved at the speed it had set for itself, and it did not ask for anything else. Admiral Sarah Okafor was on the bridge. She was not a large woman. She was not a dramatic woman. She had the kind of presence that came from knowing exactly what she was doing, and not needing anyone else to know that she knew. Her crew had served with her for 9 years, and in 9 years they had learned that she was at her quietest when the stakes were highest, and that her quiet was not the absence of feeling but the management of it, which was a different thing entirely. She stood at the main viewport and watched the council station grow from a point of light to a structure. It was enormous. The Galactic Council Station had been built 200 years ago and expanded 6 times since. It was shaped like a series of concentric rings around a central column, and it caught starlight the way a prism did, scattering it into colors that had no business being beautiful but were. Her navigator, a young man named Chen, who had been on the ship since the beginning, and who was perhaps the most composed human being she had ever met, said, "Station is hailing. Put it through." A voice came from the speakers. Drenny accent. Female. Unhurried. ERS Unyielding. This is Council Station Omega. You are cleared for approach to Docking Bay 7. Please maintain current speed and heading. Understood, said Okafor. A pause. Admiral Okafor, said the voice. And here the unhurried quality became something more deliberate, more chosen. I am Counselor Mara Voss. I will meet you at the dock. Okafor looked at the station. I'll be there, she said. She turned from the viewport. Her bridge crew was watching her. Not obviously. They were all very good at doing their jobs and watching her at the same time, which was a skill you developed when you served under someone for 9 years, and you wanted to understand what she was thinking. She understood what they wanted. They wanted to know if it had worked, if the message had landed, if the convergence data was going to matter to the people in that station the way it had mattered to the people who had compiled it, if they were going to listen, or if they were going to lock the humans in a conference room and argue about jurisdiction while the sensor records stacked up and the Kethra kept moving. She didn't know yet. She knew Voss was meeting her at the dock. That was not nothing. Prepare the data package, she said to her tactical officer. Everything. The full 3 years. Migration maps, formation density analyses, the timestamp correlation study, the communication intercepts. The intercepts? Her tactical officer, a woman named Rivas, looked up. Admiral, the Council doesn't know we've been monitoring Kethra communications. They're going to, said Okafor. Better we tell them than they find out later. Rivas hesitated. That could be a problem. Yes, said Okafor. So could the Kethra. She moved toward the door that led off the bridge. Prepare the package. All of it. She walked off the bridge. The door closed behind her. Chen and Rivas looked at each other across the nav console. She's going to give them everything, said Chen. Yes, said Rivas. He thought about the right word. That's very trusting. Rivas looked at the viewport, at the station, still growing, beautiful and strange in caught starlight. I think that's the point, she said. Mara Voss was at docking bay 7 20 minutes before the unyielding arrived. She was alone. She had not brought security. The station commander had argued with her about this for 6 minutes before she closed the channel. She stood in the bay, in the particular stillness of someone who is waiting for something they have been thinking about for a long time. The bay was large. Most bays were large. This one felt larger than usual, because she was very aware of the size of the ship that was about to dock in it, and the ship was going to fit, but only just. 11 kilometers of ship. She had been in council work for 32 years. She had met presidents and warlords and one Vethkai emperor who had 17 assassination attempts on his record, and walked like it. She had negotiated the Dreni-Sulhari border compact of 2891, while both sides were actively shooting at each other. She had once talked a Vethkai admiral out of firing on a civilian transport by having a calm conversation with him about the specific legal definitions of territorial waters, and not blinking for most of it. She was not a person who was easily impressed. She was, standing in docking bay 7, at 0320 station time, somewhat impressed. The unyielding came in on thrusters only, moving with a precision that its size had no business achieving. She felt it before she saw it. A low vibration in the deck plates, more resonance than sound, the kind of thing that bypassed your ears and went straight to the back of your chest. Then the nose appeared through the bay's magnetic seal, and then the rest of it, slowly, carefully, enormous and gray, and marked with the evidence of wherever it had been for however long it had been out there. It docked. The vibration stopped. A boarding ramp extended. Mara Voss waited. A woman walked down the ramp, medium height, dark skin, gray beginning at her temples, wearing a uniform the color of the ship. That same functional, unornamental gray. No medals, no rank insignia that Voss could read, just the uniform and the walk, which was the walk of someone who had stopped needing external signals to communicate authority a long time ago. She reached the bottom of the ramp and stopped. They looked at each other across 20 meters of deck plating. Counselor Voss, said Admiral Okafor. Admiral, said Voss. A pause. You came alone, said Okafor. So did you, said Voss. Okafor looked around the bay, then back at Voss. Something changed in her face. Not a smile, not quite. Something more internal than that. The data package is ready, she said. Everything we have. I know, said Voss. Your man Webb told me. He told you everything? He told me enough. Voss looked up at the ship, at the sealed gun ports along its flank. I want to understand something, she said, before we go to the council. Before all of it, she looked back at the admiral. You built this ship for 22 years. You sent a diplomat ahead of it. You waited 14 years inside this council, asking for nothing, taking nothing, just watching. Yes, said Okafor. Why? The admiral was quiet for a moment. Because the last 3 species who arrived in council space with a ship this size, and no introduction, arrived with their guns hot, she said, and we didn't want to do that. Mara Voss held that answer for a moment. And the Kethra, she said. We found the convergence 3 years ago, said Okafor. We've been deciding how to tell you. And this was how, said Voss. The ship, the message, the whole. She gestured vaguely at the bay. The ship, the entire sequence of events. This. We needed you to take us seriously, said Okafor. Not because we wanted to be taken seriously, because what we found. She stopped. The internal thing that was almost a smile was gone now. What we found requires everyone to be in the same room paying attention. And the best way to get everyone in the same room paying attention was to give them something they hadn't seen before. She looked at the counselor. Did it work? Mara Voss thought about the chamber, about the faces of the Vethkai and the Sulhari and her own colleagues when the word Terran came up on the sensor board, about the silence that had fallen over the convergence message like snow over ground. Yes, she said. Good, said Okafor. The other fleets are moving toward the station, said Voss. All of them. Vethkai, Sulhari, Drenni. She paused. They went quiet when the message hit. Okafor nodded. How quiet, she said. Very, said Voss. The admiral nodded again. Slower this time. Then we don't have much time, she said. Before they arrive and the politics start. She reached back toward the ship. A crew member she had clearly been expecting appeared at the top of the ramp with a data case. They carried it down and handed it to her without a word. She took it and held it out to the counselor. This is everything, she said. Every sensor reading, every migration chart, every communication intercept we recorded, the full 3 years, unedited. Voss took the case. Communication intercepts, she said carefully. Yes. The council doesn't know you've been monitoring Kethra transmissions. No, said Okafor. We're telling you now. Voss held the case. That's going to cause problems, she said. Probably, said Okafor. But if the Kethra data is what we think it is, we're going to have larger problems very soon, and I'd rather the council trust us going into that than be surprised by the intercepts later. Mara Voss looked at her. The human admiral stood at the bottom of her ship's boarding ramp, in her functional gray uniform with no medals and no visible rank, and held the counselor's gaze with the patient look of someone who had thought all of this through and was on the other side of the thinking. 32 years. Mara Voss had been doing this for 32 years. She had met presidents and warlords. She picked up her communicator. Prepare the main council chamber, she said. Full session, all available delegates. A pause, and set up a second display terminal. The admiral will need to present data. She lowered the communicator. She looked at Okafor. Come on then, she said. They walked together across the bay toward the station interior. Behind them, the ERS Unyielding sat in its dock, enormous and gray and still, its gun ports sealed, its engines cold. The quietest 11-kilometer ship in the known galaxy. The main council chamber had never held a full session at 0400 station time. It showed. The delegates arrived in various states of composure, which is to say that the Drenni arrived looking exactly as they always looked, and the Sulhari arrived looking sharp and alert, because they had been raised in a culture that considered being caught off guard to be a moral failure, and the Vethkai delegate Sorvatha arrived with one of his 4 eyes still partially closed from sleep, and a look on his face that suggested he was angry about this, but had the self-awareness to know the anger was mostly at himself for not anticipating it. Jonas Webb sat in the observers section and did not look tired, which was either because he hadn't slept or because he had been awake for this moment for 14 years, and the adrenaline was doing the work that sleep usually did. Admiral Okafor stood at the center of the chamber. The data display behind her showed a star map, council space, and the space beyond it, rendered in the blue-white light of the projection system, with the last survey markers along the outer edge of charted territory showing as yellow dots. Beyond the yellow dots, the gray. the Kethra territory. Or what everyone had assumed was Kethra territory. 3 years ago, said Okafor, we deployed a series of long-range sensor probes into the outer boundary zone, the zone that begins approximately 40 light-years past the Council's last survey marker in the galactic south. She touched a control. Red dots appeared on the map, scattered along the outer boundary like seeds. The probes were passive, non-transmitting. They recorded data on a compressed timeline and used a relay burst system to send that data back to us every 90 days. She touched the control again. Here is what they found. The map changed. The gray beyond the boundary was no longer empty. Points of light appeared in it. Not the clean, fixed points of stars. Moving points, dense points, clustered in patterns that even the least tactically minded person in the room could see were not random. Mara Voss had seen the data summary. She had not seen the full display. She felt the structure of the chamber shift around her. Not dramatically, quietly, the way rooms shift when everyone in them recalibrates something at the same time. The Kethra have always migrated, said Okafor. Your records go back 3 centuries. The migration pattern was consistent. They moved through the outer boundary zone in cycles of approximately 40 years, in loose formations of between 300 and 800 units, following a path that curved around the galactic south and returned to their point of origin. We know this, said Preth. The Sulhari ambassador's voice was careful, not dismissive. Careful, the way you are careful with something you are not sure is fragile, but you have decided to treat as if it might be. What your records don't show, said Okafor, because none of your probes penetrated far enough into the boundary zone to catch it, is what the current migration looks like. She touched the control. The dots on the map moved. It was a time lapse. 3 years of data compressed into 40 seconds. The Kethra units, and there were far more of them than 300 to 800, moved across the display in the specific, converging pattern that the word migration did not cover. Migration spread out. They dispersed. They followed resource gradients and seasonal cycles. This was not spreading out. This was drawing in. The dots moved from every point on the outer boundary toward a central region, a specific region. A region that, when Mara Voss overlaid the standard galactic coordinate grid in her head, sat at approximately galactic south-southwest, said Sorvaith. All 4 of his eyes were fully open now. That's the approach corridor for the Vethkai outer rim. It is one of 4 approach corridors they are moving toward, said Okafor. The other 3 intersect with Sulhari expansion space, Drenni primary territory, and the independent systems cluster in the galactic east. Silence. The map kept showing the dots. Moving. Converging. Patient in the way that things are patient when they are very large and not in any hurry. How many units, said Fenn, the Council's tactical officer. Her voice was flat. This was either professional composure or the particular flatness that came from already doing the math and not wanting to be the first person to say the number out loud. Okafor looked at her. At last count, she said, 47,000. The number went into the room like a stone into water. 47,000 Kethra units. The largest recorded Kethra migration in the Council's 3 centuries of records had been 800 units. That migration had brushed the edge of Drenni space 70 years ago, briefly. 3 Drenni survey ships had gone to observe. None of them had returned. The Council had moved their survey markers back 40 light-years as a precaution. 47,000. You said communication intercepts, said Mara Voss. She said it because the number was too large to process immediately, and she needed the conversation to keep moving, or the chamber was going to stay silent for longer than was useful. What did you hear? Okafor touched another control. The map faded. The audio display replaced it. Waveform readouts, frequency analyses, the visual record of what had taken her communications team 14 months to partially decode. The Kethra communicate on a frequency band your equipment cannot register without modification, she said. We noticed this in our 2nd year of probe deployment and recalibrated accordingly. She looked around the chamber. What we found is that the Kethra have been communicating at a much higher rate than their historical baseline. The volume of communication has increased by a factor of approximately 9 over the past 3 years. What are they saying? Said Van Ash. The Drenni fleet commander had arrived 30 minutes ago with 4 of her senior officers and had been sitting without speaking since. Her voice, when it came, was steady. We have a partial decode, said Okafor. Approximately 30% of the signal content. The rest is either encrypted in a system we haven't cracked, or uses references we don't have the cultural context to understand. 30%, said Venash. What does 30% tell you? Okafor looked at her. It tells us they know we're here, she said, and that they have been discussing us for at least 3 years, possibly longer. 3 years is how far back our probes go. The room absorbed this. Discussing us, said Sorvaith. In what context? The translation is imprecise, said Okafor. We want to be careful about over-interpreting incomplete data. She paused. But the most consistent element across the decoded segments, the concept that appears most often, and with the most signal emphasis, translates most closely as. She stopped. Not for effect, she was choosing the word carefully. Boundary, she said. Or possibly threshold. The distinction matters in their language in a way it doesn't in ours, and we haven't fully mapped it yet, but the concept appears in reference to council space specifically. Another pause. And it appears with an increasing frequency that correlates directly with the change in migration pattern. They think we've crossed something, said Preth. Some line, some limit. That's one interpretation, said Okafor. It's the one our team considers most probable. What's the other interpretation? Said Mara Voss. Okafor looked at her. That they think we're about to cross it, she said. The difference between those two interpretations was the difference between a problem you were already inside and a problem you might still be able to step back from. Everyone in the room understood this. Everyone in the room was also aware that they were sitting in a chamber on a station in council space, which was the space the Kethra appeared to be discussing, which meant the question of whether they had already crossed the line or were about to was somewhat academic. We have been operating in the outer boundary zone for 2 centuries, said Sorvaith. Survey missions, mining operations, navigation buoys. If we crossed a line, we don't know when or how. No, said Okafor. We don't. Then how do we? He stopped, started again. What is the appropriate response to a boundary violation you didn't know was a boundary? That, said Okafor, is what we've been trying to figure out for 3 years. She touched the control again. The map returned, but differently this time. Council space in blue, the outer boundary zone in gray, the Kethra convergence pattern in red, and overlaid on all of it, in thin white lines, a series of proposed vectors. We have modeled the convergence, she said. Based on current speed and direction, the leading elements of the Kethra formation will reach the outer boundary zone in approximately 14 months. The main formation will follow approximately 9 months after that. 23 months, said Venash. Yes. Until they reach the outer boundary zone, said Venash. How long after that until they reach inhabited systems? If they continue at current speed, said Okafor, another 4 to 7 months, depending on the approach vector. 2 years, roughly. A little more, a little less. 2 years, until the thing that had destroyed 6 Drenny ships and been classified as inconclusive in the archive arrived in force, 47,000 units strong, discussing boundaries in a language nobody fully understood. You have a proposal, said Mara Voss. She said it because she had been watching Okafor for the past 30 minutes, and the Admiral had the posture of someone with a proposal. Not certain, not aggressive, just prepared. The way people are prepared when they have spent a long time thinking about a problem and have arrived at a position they are ready to defend. We have an idea, said Okafor. Not a plan, an idea. She looked around the chamber. But it requires all of you to agree to something first. What? Said Preth. Trust, said Okafor. Specifically, mutual trust, which means no one acts unilaterally. No Vethkai ships firing on Kethra scouts. No Sulhari mining operations in the outer boundary zone. No Drenny survey missions that might be interpreted as provocation. She paused. And no human ships either. You're asking us to stand down, said Sorvaith, while a force of 47,000 enemy units moves toward our space. I'm asking you to hold, said Okafor. There's a difference. She looked at him. Standing down means giving up. Holding means choosing not to move until you understand what you're in. And you think you know what we're in, said Sorvaith. I think we might be in a misunderstanding, said Okafor. And I think misunderstandings are a great deal easier to resolve before anyone shoots than after. The chamber was quiet. Mara Voss looked at the map. at the red dots converging on a space that contained everything the species in this room had built over centuries. Everything they had argued over, and divided and mapped and argued about some more. "The idea," she said. "What is it?" Okafor looked at her. "We go talk to them," she said. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. This one had a specific texture. It was the silence of people who had just heard something that their instincts told them was either the best or the worst thing they had heard in a long time, and couldn't yet determine which. "The Kethra have never accepted contact," said Van Ash. 3 attempts. None of them. "None of them had complete communication intercepts," said Okafor. "None of them knew what the Kethra were saying before they went in. We do. 30% is incomplete. It's also 30% more than anyone has ever had." "And you think that's enough to?" Van Ash stopped. Who would go? Okafor didn't answer immediately. Mara Voss looked at her. "You," said Voss. "We have the intercepts," said Okafor. "We have the best partial translation. We have a ship that can reach the outer boundary zone before the Kethra formation does." She looked around the chamber one more time. At the Drenni, and the Sulhari, and the Vethkai. At Jonas Webb, in the observers section, watching with the expression of someone who had known this moment was coming, and still found it larger than expected. "And we haven't sent 3 missions into Kethra space that ended badly. We don't have that particular history with them." "You have no history with them," said Sorvaith. "Yes," said Okafor. "That's the point." Nobody spoke. The map glowed in the center of the chamber. Blue and gray and red, the colors of what was known and what was unknown and what was coming. Sorvaith looked at Van Ash. Van Ash looked at Preth. Preth looked at Mara Voss. Mara Voss looked at Okafor. "You have a ship," said Voss. "I have a ship," said Okafor. "You have a crew willing to do this." Okafor didn't answer immediately. Which was, Voss noted, the most honest answer she had given so far. "I have a crew that understands what the alternative looks like," said Okafor. "That's close enough." Mara Voss looked at the map for a long moment. Then she looked at the chamber. "Vote," she said. The vote took 4 minutes. It was not unanimous. Sorvaith abstained, because the Vethkai did not vote yes on things they weren't certain of, and did not vote no on things they couldn't afford to block. Abstaining was a Vethkai tradition that meant, "We are watching this very carefully, and reserve the right to have a strong opinion later." But the vote passed. 3-0 with 1 abstention. The ERS Unyielding was authorized to proceed to the outer boundary zone and attempt first contact with the Kethra convergence. Okafor acknowledged the vote without ceremony. She looked at Jonas Webb. Webb nodded once. She walked out of the chamber. Behind her, the map still glowed. The red dots still moved. Patient, slow, enormous. 14 months to the boundary. The Unyielding had been in dock for 6 hours. It was going to need to leave very soon. The Unyielding left Council Station at 0900. The other ships were still arriving when it departed. Mara Voss stood at the station's observation deck and watched the Vethkai destroyers coming in from the east, while the 11-kilometer gray ship moved out in the opposite direction. The contrast was not subtle. She had a communicator in her hand, she was not using it. There was nothing to say yet that she hadn't already said, and things you say before someone goes into the gray tend to either mean too much or not enough, and she had always preferred the discipline of silence to the mess of the other kind. She watched until the Unyielding was out of visual range. Then she went back inside to deal with the Vethkai. Chen had the navigation plot on his console from the moment the ship cleared the station's sensor envelope. The route to the outer boundary zone was straightforward. 41 light-years, mostly clear space, 2 minor navigation hazards that were well documented and easily avoided. At the Unyielding's fold capability, they could cover the distance in 3 jumps. 6 days in transit, approximately. He ran the numbers twice. He ran them twice because he wanted to be sure, and because having something precise to focus on was useful, when the thing he was actually thinking about was that they were going to arrive in a region of space that had destroyed every ship that had ever gone there voluntarily, and try to start a conversation. The math was clean. Everything else was less so. "Jump solution ready," he said. "Hold," said Okafor. He held. She was at the center of the bridge, standing at the data terminal, going through the intercept files again. She had been through them so many times over the past 3 years that her communications team had started quietly worrying about her, which was something they did carefully, because the Admiral was not a person who responded well to being worried about. The intercepts. 30% decoded. The rest, noise, or meaning, or something between the two that their translation models couldn't yet map. The concept that appeared most consistently, boundary, threshold, the thing the Kethra were discussing in reference to council space. She had a theory. She hadn't shared it with the council because theories presented to committees produced committee discussions, and committee discussions produced delays, and she had not spent 22 years building a ship and 3 years decoding radio signals to be delayed by a committee discussion. She had shared it with 3 people: her tactical officer Rivas, her linguistics lead, a quiet woman named Dr. Yoon who had joined the program 8 years ago and had barely slept in the past 14 months, and Jonas Webb, who had listened to it in her office on the station the night before and sat for a long time without saying anything. The theory was this: the Kethra had not responded to contact attempts because no one had attempted contact in the right way. Welly, the first attempt, 70 years ago, had sent 3 armed Drenni survey ships to the boundary. The ships had hailed in 17 languages. The Kethra had destroyed them. The second attempt, 40 years ago, had sent a single Sulhari diplomatic vessel with a full council letter of intent and offerings of trade. The ship had been destroyed before it crossed the boundary. The third attempt, 20 years ago, had sent an unmanned probe. The probe had been destroyed within 6 hours. Every attempt had approached from inside council space. Every attempt had, in the Kethra's frame of reference, come from the wrong side of something. That was the theory. They were coming from the wrong side. The Kethra were moving toward council space, converging on it, 47,000 units strong, because council space was on their side of the boundary. Because the boundary, whatever it was, whatever historical or territorial or cultural significance it held, was not the council's outer edge. It was the Kethra's inner edge. And everything inside it, from the Kethra's perspective, might not be a foreign territory being encroached upon. It might be their own territory being occupied. Dr. Yoon had been the one to crack the distinction. She had spent 4 months on the boundary versus threshold problem, and the solution had come to her at 0300 on a Tuesday during her 3rd cup of coffee. And she had been so certain and so shaken by it that she had called Okafor's quarters directly, which was something nobody did, and which told Okafor everything she needed to know about the significance of the finding before Yoon had said a word. Threshold, in the Kethra communication structure, referred to a boundary that could be crossed. Boundary referred to a boundary that could not. The Kethra were not using threshold. Okafor looked up from the terminal. "Vethkai fleet is hailing," said Rivas. "Fleet Admiral Sor Kathy. He says..." She paused. "He says he would like to offer an escort." Okafor looked at her. "An escort," she said. "His words," said Rivas. "He says..." Another pause, longer this time, the pause of someone reading a message that contains more than the words in it. "He says, the Vethkai 3rd Formation has 16 destroyers that can match the Unyielding's fold speed. He understands that the mission is contact, not combat. He is asking if the Admiral would prefer to not go alone." The bridge was quiet. Okafor looked at the forward display, at the space ahead of the ship, empty and star-scattered and leading, in a direction she had been pointing toward for 3 years, toward the boundary. She thought about 47,000 units. She thought about 3 failed contact attempts. She thought about a Vethkai admiral who had read a message about the Kethra convergence and gone silent, and then turned his fleet around and driven toward the council station, and who was now, apparently, asking to follow a human ship into the most dangerous region of space in the known galaxy. "Tell him no," she said. Rivas blinked. "Admiral, tell him no." "With thanks," said Okafor, "and tell him that if this works, there will be time for the Vethkai to be involved in everything that follows, and if it doesn't work..." She turned back to the terminal. "There's no point in losing 16 more ships." Rivas relayed the message. A reply came back 2 minutes later. Rivas read it. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. "He says," said Rivas. "Understood. We will hold position and keep our guns cold. You taught us that." She paused. And then he says, "Good hunting." Okafor was quiet for a moment. "Tell him thank you," she said, "and then give me the jump solution." Chen had the solution ready. He had been ready for 12 minutes. "Jump solution on your mark," he said. "Mark," said Okafor. The unyielding folded. They came out of the first jump at the edge of a debris field that wasn't on any current chart, because it had been formed by the collision of 2 asteroids approximately 15 years ago, which was recent on a geological scale, and recent enough on a navigational scale to require a 6-hour detour. Chen handled the detour with the calm efficiency of someone who considers unexpected obstacles to be a navigation problem rather than a personal affront. Okafor spent the 6 hours with Dr. Yoon. Yoon's workspace was on Deck 7, in a section of the ship that had been converted from storage during the build-out. It was full of displays showing waveform analyses and translation matrices, and the particular organized chaos of a space occupied by someone who thinks very quickly and moves slowly. There were 3 half-empty coffee cups on the desk. Yoon noticed Okafor looking at them and moved them without comment. "The boundary concept," said Okafor. "Walk me through it again." "The Kethra language has a structural feature our translation models initially classified as redundancy," said Yoon. She sat down and pulled up a waveform display. "The same concept encoded multiple times in each transmission unit, with slight variations in each encoding. We thought it was signal reinforcement, noise reduction. It wasn't. It was specificity." Yoon pointed at the waveform. "Each encoding is a different semantic layer of the same concept. Like, imagine if every time you said the word home, you simultaneously communicated whether you meant your current house, your childhood house, your cultural origin, or the concept of belonging in general. All at once, same word, but with 4 layers of meaning, each slightly distinct. And the boundary concept has 6 layers," said Yoon. "We've decoded 4 of them reliably. The first is spatial, a physical location. The second is temporal, a location that has existed for a specific length of time. The third is..." She stopped. "This is the one that took me longest. The third layer encodes something like precedence, prior claim, the concept that the boundary exists because it was there first." Okafor sat down across from her. "They think it was theirs before it was ours," she said. "I think they don't think it in the way you're using that word," said Yoon. "I think for them it's not a belief, it's a fact. The way the age of a mountain is a fact. It was there before them. It will be there after. It simply is." "And the 4th layer?" Yoon was quiet for a moment. "The 4th layer," she said, "is the hardest to put into words that don't distort the meaning." She pulled up a different display. "The closest I've come is a boundary that is also a responsibility. Not just this is ours. This is ours, and we are responsible for it. We are its stewards." She looked at the display. "The Kethra don't just think of themselves as living in their territory. They think of themselves as its guardians." Okafor sat with this. "What are they guarding it from?" she said. Yoon looked at her. "That," she said, "is what the 2 layers we haven't decoded yet might tell us." She turned back to the display. "I've been working on them since we left the station. There are patterns. I can see the structures, but the referential content, the specific concepts they're pointing at, I can't resolve them yet. They reference things we don't have in our translation database, things we've never encountered, things that might be why," said Okafor. "Yes," said Yoon, "things that might be why." They sat in the organized chaos of Deck 7 and looked at waveforms that were trying to become words, and beyond the hull of the ship, the debris field drifted in silence, and beyond the debris field, 41 light-years of space waited to be crossed. "When we get there," said Okafor, "when we reach the boundary zone, I want to be transmitting on their frequency from the moment we come out of the fold." "I know," said Yoon. "Not hailing," said Okafor. "Broadcasting. The intercepts, playing their own communications back to them, on their frequency. At the source encoding level your team identified." Yoon nodded. "You want them to know we were listening," said Yoon. "I want them to know we were paying attention," said Okafor. "There's a difference," Yoon looked at her the way people look at admirals who say things that sound like distinctions between similar concepts but are actually the difference between a mission that works and one that doesn't. Yes, she said, there is. The second jump put them inside the outer boundary zone. Nobody had been in the outer boundary zone since the last council survey, 20 years ago, which had placed its markers and left before anything could happen to it. Chen came out of the fold and immediately ran a full sensor sweep. The sweep came back clean. No Kethra units in the immediate vicinity. We're early, he said. Yes, said Okafor. The formation is still 14 months out. The leading edge might not be, said Rivas. From tactical. She was watching her own display. The data we have is 3 months old at minimum, if any units have accelerated. Keep scanning, said Okafor. The ship moved deeper into the zone. The outer boundary zone was not empty. It was full of the slow, unremarkable material of deep space. Dust, minor debris, the occasional rogue planetoid on an orbit so large that it had probably been traveling since before the Council's oldest recorded civilization. The kind of space that was neither hostile nor welcoming, just there, old and patient and enormous. Okafor stood at the viewport and looked at it. She had been in space for 30 years. The emptiness did not affect her the way it affected people who hadn't been in it long enough. But this particular emptiness was different from other emptinesses. This was the space that existed between what was known and what was not, and that distinction lived in it, the way cold lived in a room that hadn't been heated in a long time. Contact, said Rivas. The word hit the bridge like a stone. Not an enemy alert tone. Not an alarm. Just Rivas's voice, flat and precise, because Rivas was good at her job, and her job right now was to report what the sensors showed without adding what she felt about it. Single unit, said Rivas. Bearing 073. Range approximately 8,000 kilometers. She paused. It wasn't there on the last sweep. How long ago was the last sweep, said Chen. 90 seconds, said Rivas. A unit that could travel fast enough to move from below sensor threshold to 8,000 kilometers in 90 seconds. Second unit, said Rivas. Range 11,000. Bearing 091. Another pause. Third unit, bearing. I see it, said Okafor. She had moved to the tactical display. The screen was filling. Not quickly. Slowly. The way things fill when they have been there for a while and simply been too close to detect, which was a thought that did not make Okafor feel better about the quality of her sensor array. 12 units. Then 20. Then, as the sweep range extended and the computer updated its extrapolations, something considerably larger than 20. The leading edge had arrived. Dr. Yoon, said Okafor. Yoon's voice came from the intercom instantly. She had been monitoring the bridge from Deck 7. Ready, said Yoon. Begin transmission, said Okafor. The Unyielding began broadcasting. Kethra communications, played back on Kethra frequencies, at Kethra encoding levels. 3 years of intercepted signal, selected and ordered by Dr. Yoon in the sequence she had determined was most likely to convey. We were listening, we understood some of it, and we are here because we want to understand more. Not a translation, not a greeting in the traditional sense. An acknowledgement. We heard you talking. We came to listen better. The units on the sensor display stopped moving. Every single one of them. Chen looked at Okafor. Okafor looked at the display. Hold course, she said. Maintain transmission. Nobody does anything. The bridge crew was very still. On the sensor display, 43 Kethra units sat at various ranges from the Unyielding, motionless, not retreating, not advancing, not doing what every previous encounter had eventually produced. They were listening. The Unyielding broadcast its signal into the gray, and the gray listened back. It was Rivas who noticed it first. She had been watching the frequency monitors alongside the spatial sensors, because Rivas was the kind of tactical officer who watched more things simultaneously than most people could track. Admiral, she said. Okafor looked at her display. The Kethra were transmitting. Not toward the Unyielding specifically, broad transmission, on their own frequency, in their own encoding. But the volume had changed. The rate had changed. The same signal analysis that Dr. Yoon had spent 14 months developing could show, in real time, that the volume and rate of Kethra communication had increased significantly in the 3 minutes since the Unyielding began broadcasting. They were talking to each other. About what was happening. "Yoon," said Okafor. "I see it," said Yoon, from Deck 7. Her voice had changed. The flat, analytical quality was still there, but underneath it, something that was less professional and more human had gotten in, the way light gets in under a door. "I'm running the signal through the translation matrix now. The speed is different. The signal structure is a pause. They're excited." The word seemed wrong. It also seemed exactly right. "Can you decode any of it?" said Okafor. "Some," said Yoon. "It's coming in faster than the matrix can process cleanly. But I can see the boundary concept. It's in almost every segment. A longer pause. And there's something new. A concept we haven't seen before, paired with the boundary concept, almost every time." "What concept?" said Okafor. "The longest pause yet." "Return," said Yoon, "or something very close to it." She was quiet for a moment. They might be saying that something has come back." Okafor looked at the sensor display, at the 43 motionless units surrounding her ship at various distances, at the transmission monitors showing a burst of communication that hadn't been in any of the 3 years of baseline data. "Return. Something has come back." She looked at Chen. "Maintain position," she said, "and keep broadcasting." Chen nodded. They stayed. The gray held them. The Kethra stayed still, and transmitted, and listened to humans playing their own voices back to them in the dark. And for the first time in 3 attempts spanning 70 years, nothing was destroyed. That was enough. For now, that was everything. The Unyielding stayed in the outer boundary zone for 11 days. Nobody at the council station slept well during those 11 days. Mara Voss did not sleep at all on the 3rd night, or the 7th, or the 9th, which was when the first partial translation came in from Dr. Yoon, and everyone who was awake to read it, which was most of the council, because the habit of not sleeping had spread from Voss outward like a contagion, stopped what they were doing, and read it in silence. The translation was incomplete. Yoon had marked it carefully with probability scores, and flagged every section where the matrix had applied inference rather than direct decoding. She was rigorous in a way that was, Voss thought, either a great strength or a form of protection, and possibly both at the same time. The segments they were most confident about. "We have heard speaking that we know. We have not heard it in the manner of those who come to take. We have heard it in the manner of those who come to understand. This is different. We are deciding what this means." Mara Voss read those words 3 times. She read them at 0300 in her office, with a cup of something warm that had stopped being tea 2 hours ago, but was still keeping her hands occupied. She read them, and thought about the 6 Drenny ships, and the 312 names, and the archive word, inconclusive. "We are deciding what this means." She looked at the second part of the transmission. The segments Yoon had flagged as lower confidence but included, because the structural patterns were strong enough to be worth sharing. The boundary was placed in the time before speaking. Those who placed it are gone. We keep it because we remember. We did not know if the ones inside had forgotten. The ones inside. Council space. That was what that meant. Council space was inside the boundary, from the Kethra's perspective, and the question of whether the ones inside had forgotten something was. Voss read the next segment twice, slowly. The question of whether anyone inside the boundary still knew why it was there. Why it had been placed. In the time before speaking. Before language. Before the council. Before the oldest recorded history of any species in the chamber. The boundary predated everyone. She set down her cup and looked out the viewport at the station exterior, at the ships still holding position, Vethkai destroyers, Sulhari dreadnoughts, Drenny vessels, all of them quiet, all of them waiting, and felt the specific sensation of standing at the edge of something very large that she couldn't yet see the full shape of. She picked up her communicator. "Get me Yun," she said. "Direct line to the ship." The signal delay between the station and the Unyielding was 22 minutes each way. This meant conversations happened in 44-minute gaps, which was not ideal for anything requiring nuance or follow-up questions, but it was what they had. Mara Voss sent her question at 0330. At 0414, Dr. Yoon's voice came back across 40 light-years of signal relay. "We're working on the time before speaking problem," said Yoon. "It appears in the Kethra signal with a specific emotional, I want to say emotional. The matrix flags this as a significant semantic register shift. Wait. It's not just a time reference. It's a reverent time reference. The way some cultures talk about creation events or founding myths. Something that defines everything that came after it." A pause in the recording. "The boundary wasn't made by the Kethra," said Yun. "We're fairly confident of this. It predates them as well. Whatever placed it, and here's where it gets very interesting, Counselor, whatever placed it apparently also placed the Kethra as its guardians. Not chose them, placed them. As if the guardianship and the Kethra as a species came from the same source event." Another pause. "I know how that sounds. We're being very careful with the inference layers. But the signal structure supports it. They guard the boundary because they were made to guard the boundary. It is the oldest thing in their self-understanding." The message ended. Mara Voss sat with it for a long time. Something that predated the Kethra had drawn a line around a region of space and created a species to guard it. That something was gone. The species remained. And now the ones inside the boundary had come out in a ship that played the Guardian's own language back to them and said, in the clearest possible way available to beings who had never spoken, "We were listening." She thought about what Admiral Okafor had said in the docking bay. The best way to get everyone in the same room paying attention was to give them something they hadn't seen before. She thought about Jonas Webb sitting in the observers section during the council vote, watching with the expression of someone who had known this moment was coming, and still found it larger than expected. She thought about what Okafor had said to Sorvaith. "We don't have that particular history with them." And she thought about the translation segment she had read 3 times. "Those who placed it are gone. We keep it because we remember. We did not know if the ones inside had forgotten." The question was never whether the Kethra were coming to invade. The question was whether anyone inside the boundary still knew what it meant. And the humans, who had no history with the Kethra, who had come into council space quietly and built a ship over 22 years, and sent a diplomat, and waited 14 years, and then arrived with their guns cold, and played 47,000 guardians their own language. The humans had walked into that question from the outside and given it an answer. "We were listening. We came to understand." The answer wasn't, "We remember." The answer was, "We are willing to learn." And apparently, for the Kethra, that was enough. On day 11, the Unyielding transmitted a new message. Not to the Kethra, to the council station. Admiral Okafor's voice, over the relay, with the 22-minute delay stripped out by the time it arrived because the signal had been boosted at the midpoint relay station. "We've been in dialogue for 9 days. I want to be careful with that word. It hasn't been dialogue in the way we understand dialogue. There are no back-and-forth exchanges, no question-and-answer sequences. What we've had is concurrent speaking. We transmit. They transmit. Dr. Yoon and her team work through the night mapping the intersections." A pause. "The Kethra are not coming to attack. I want to say that clearly and without qualification. The convergence is not a military operation. It is." Another pause, longer. "The closest word we have is inspection. They are coming to examine the boundary, to assess whether it has been violated and in what way, and what the appropriate response is." 3 years ago, the trigger for the convergence was a Sulhari mining operation in the outer boundary zone. Specifically, in a region of the zone that the Kethra considered to be the active marker line, the point where the boundary registers as present. The mining operation extracted material from that zone. The Kethra don't want the material back. The material isn't the issue. What they experienced was the equivalent of someone reaching through a wall they had been guarding for longer than recorded history and pulling a stone out of it. Not to attack, not even to steal, from the human perspective of the intent, just to take, because the wall appeared to be a resource rather than a structure. We've been transmitting the Sulhari mining coordinates and timeline back to them with the strongest confidence encoding Yoon's team can generate. We want them to understand that we know where it happened, that we understand why it matters. Their response to that transmission was the most complex thing we've received so far. Yoon has it. She'll send the full analysis to the council. But the core of it, The highest confidence segment is this. Okafor's voice was steady. The signal was clear. Those who do not know the wall cannot be responsible for touching it. They are not interested in punishment. They are interested in acknowledgement. A long pause. I think we can give them that. The full council session on day 12 was the quietest one Mara Voss had attended in 32 years. Not the silence of shock, not the silence of horror or confusion, or political calculation, the silence of people who had been given information large enough to require a different relationship with the noise they had been making, and had, at least temporarily, accepted the requirement. Sorvaith spoke first. The Sulhari mining operation, he said. He was looking at Preth as he said it, which was unusual. The Vethkai and the Sulhari did not usually make eye contact when they were about to say something pointed. Preth met his gaze. Was within what we understood to be neutral space, she said, based on the coordinates in the last council survey. Yes, said Sorvaith, and the survey was wrong. The survey was incomplete, said Mara Voss. She said it carefully, not to protect the Sulhari, but because the distinction mattered. The boundary was not in our maps because we didn't know it existed. No one did. We do now, said Venash. This was the thing about the Drenni. They did not waste words on things that had already been established. We do now, said Voss. The Kethra want acknowledgement, said Preth. Her voice was even. She had the specific composure of someone who was taking responsibility for something and was not going to make it a performance. What form does that take? Yun's team is working on that, said Voss. The Admiral believes there is a format within Kethra communication structure for what we might call a formal recognition, an acknowledgement that carries the same semantic weight in their language as a treaty would in ours. She paused. She also believes the Unyielding should be the one to transmit it. Not a council transmission, said Preth. The Kethra have established communication with the Unyielding. They have not established communication with the council. Voss looked around the chamber. And the Admiral's position is that asking them to accept a new correspondent in the middle of an ongoing exchange is the kind of disruption that we cannot afford right now. Preth nodded. Sorvaith looked at the map, at the convergence pattern, still moving, slower now. Rivas had sent a note through the relay that the Kethra formation appeared to have reduced speed on day 8, which correlated with the day the Unyielding had transmitted the mining coordinates. The Admiral will transmit the acknowledgement on the Council's behalf, said Sorvaith. It was not a question. Yes, said Voss. And then we wait, said Voss. And we start the process of remapping the boundary zone. All of it. With the Kethra's help, if they're willing. She paused. And we stop operating in the outer zone until we know exactly where the line is. That affects current Sulhari operations in... Yes, said Preth, cutting off her own delegate. It does. We'll stop them. Nobody argued. The vote to authorize the acknowledgement transmission took 3 minutes. It was unanimous, including Sorvaith. The acknowledgement went out from the Unyielding on day 13. Dr. Yun had worked for 56 continuous hours on the encoding. She had checked it against every segment of the 3-year database. She had run it through the matrix forward and backward. She had then, apparently, sat on the floor of her workspace and cried for approximately 4 minutes, which she mentioned in her transmission notes to Okafor in the precise, clinical way that she noted everything, and then had gone back to her terminal and checked it one more time. The acknowledgement said, in Kethra encoding, at the highest semantic register Yun's translation could reliably access. We touched the wall without knowing it was a wall. We know now. We will not touch it again until we understand what it keeps. We would like to understand what it keeps. We are asking permission to listen further. The transmission took 40 seconds. Then, the Unyielding went quiet and waited. The response came in 2 hours. Not 43 units transmitting. The entire formation. 47,000 Kethra units, all at once, broadcasting on the same frequency at the same moment. A single transmission that nearly overwhelmed Yun's monitoring equipment and sent the sensor arrays into a recalibration cycle and woke everyone on the ship who was asleep. Okafor was on the bridge in 4 minutes. Yun's voice on the intercom, steady despite everything. Processing. Give me 10 minutes. 10 minutes. The bridge crew waited. Chen sat at his console and did not look at the sensor display showing 47,000 units, none of which were moving. all of which were transmitting. Rivas sat at tactical and did not reach for any weapon control. The ship held position in the gray zone and let the transmission wash over it and waited for 10 minutes. Yoon's voice came back. "It's a 4-layer transmission," she said. "First layer, high confidence. Acknowledged. Second layer, the word I've been translating as return, but I want to revise. I think it's closer to recognized or known again. Something that was known and then lost and has now been found." A pause. "Third layer. This is the part I'm least certain about, but I want to share it anyway. Something like sufficient. We have given them enough. Not everything. Not a complete accounting. But enough to satisfy something they needed satisfied." A longer pause. "Fourth layer," said Yun. "This is the one I'm certain about. I've checked it 6 ways. The concept is in the highest confidence category we have." Okafor waited. "The 4th layer," said Yun, "is patience." Another pause. "Specifically, the patience of a very long wait that has finally produced an acceptable result." The bridge was very quiet. Okafor stood at the center of it and looked at the transmission data on the main display and thought about the time before speaking, and guardians placed by something that was now gone, and a boundary drawn around a region of space that had become, over centuries of exploration and mapping and mining and war, the home of 4 species who hadn't known the wall was there. 47,000 units had converged on that home to see if anyone inside it was still capable of stopping and listening and asking what the wall was for. And a species that had shown up in council space 14 years ago with a handshake and a diplomat and a ship they'd been building in secret for 8 years before that had been the ones to ask. "Signal the council station," said Okafor. "Yes, Admiral," said her communications officer. "Tell Counselor Voss." She stopped, looked at the data, at the 4-layer transmission from 47,000 units that had come to the edge of everything anyone knew, and found a human ship broadcasting their own language back to them. Tell her it worked. Mara Voss received the message at 0600 on day 14. She was at her desk. She had slept finally for 4 hours, and had woken with the clarity that sometimes comes after a long sleep deferred, the specific quality of mind that arrives when the body has finally been given what it asked for, and has returned something in exchange. She read the message. She sat for a while. Then she went to the observation deck. The Vethkai destroyers were still holding position. So were the Sulhari ships and the Drenni fleet. All of them quiet, as they had been since the convergence message hit, as they had been since a council that had been arguing about border coordinates and resource rights and mining zones for 6 decades had looked up at a sensor board and seen the word Terran and felt the ground shift. They had all gone quiet. And in the quiet, something had become possible that the noise had been preventing. She stood at the viewport and looked at the ships and the stars and the space between them, which was the same space it had always been, and was now, in some way she didn't have full language for yet, understood differently. The boundary was out there. They didn't know its full extent. They didn't know everything it kept. The Kethra were still 47,000 units of something that had destroyed ships and couldn't be fully translated, and had existed for longer than history. But they were also something that would transmit 4-layer messages of patience to a single ship that had come out to listen. And the humans had come out to listen. Not because they were told to. Not because the council authorized it. The council had authorized it, but the idea had come from somewhere else, from 22 years of building, and 14 years of waiting, and 3 years of decoding radio signals in the dark, and one admiral who had stood in a docking bay and said, "We wanted to ask before we did anything else." Mara Voss had been in council work for 32 years. She had met presidents and warlords. She had never met a species that built a ship for 22 years and then, when the time came to use it, sailed it to the edge of known space with its guns cold. She was going to remember that. She was going to write it into the council record in language that lasted, because things that lasted were the things the council was supposed to be for, and this thing deserved to last. She looked out at the ships and the stars. Then she picked up her communicator. "Get me Webb," she said. "Jonas Webb." Webb answered in 2 minutes. He sounded awake, which meant he had probably not slept at all. "Counselor," he said. "It worked," she said. A pause. "Yes," he said. "How long did you think this would take?" she said. "From the beginning. The full plan. The ship, the diplomat, the intercepts, all of it. How long did you think it would take to get to this point? She heard him think. We had optimistic models and pessimistic models, he said. The optimistic model said 30 years. We're at 22. You're ahead of schedule. We're ahead of schedule, he agreed. She stood at the viewport and looked at the stars. What's the next step in the plan, she said. A longer pause. There isn't one, said Webb. This was as far as we planned. Everything from here. He stopped. We thought if we could get to a point where the Kethra acknowledged us, we'd figure out the rest together. Together. She looked at the Vethkai ships, and the Sulhari dreadnoughts, and the Drenni vessels, and thought about 4 species that had been arguing about boundary coordinates and resource rights for 60 years, all of them holding position in the same piece of space, all of them quiet, all of them watching the same dot on the sensor display cross toward the outer zone, to attempt the conversation nobody had managed in 70 years. All of them, for the first time in Maravas's career, pointing in the same direction. Together, she said. Yes, said Webb. She looked at the stars. That might, she said, be exactly the right next step. 40 light-years away, in the outer boundary zone, the ERS Unyielding held its position in the gray and kept its guns cold and broadcast Kethra signals into the dark. Patient, as it had always been, as it had always intended to be. Waiting, not because it was afraid to move, but because it had understood something that 22 years of building had taught it, and 14 years of watching had confirmed, and 3 years of listening in the dark had made certain. The most powerful thing in any room was not the one who was loudest. It was the one who could afford to be quiet. And the humans, who had arrived with a handshake and a diplomat and an 11-kilometer ship with its guns sealed and its engines cold, had been very, very quiet. For a very, very long time. And now the whole galaxy was listening.